If you could step back in time and wake up on an ordinary morning in the year 536, you might at first think that nothing had changed. The sun would rise, people would go about their work, and life would seem to follow its usual patterns. But very quickly, you would realize that something was wrong. The light of the sun would not be the light you know. It would be weaker, dimmer, and tinged with a strange, cold haze. The air itself would feel different, not just because of the chill, but because of the stillness, the heaviness, the way the world seemed quieter than it should be. Historians today call 536 the worst year to be alive. That is not an exaggeration made for drama. It is a conclusion drawn from evidence scattered across ancient writings, tree rings, and layers of ice preserved for centuries. Those records tell the same unsettling story. A mysterious veil settled over much of the earth, darkening the skies for more than a year. Temperatures dropped sharply, crops failed, famine spread, and what followed in the years afterward would test the limits of human survival. The people of the time did not know why it was happening. They had no concept of climate science, no satellites to watch the skies, no meteorologists to give warnings. All they knew was that the sun seemed to have lost its strength, and the warmth of summer never truly came. From the British Isles to the far reaches of China, observers wrote of the same strange phenomenon: a sun that shone but gave little heat. If you woke up in 536, the world would already be in the grip of this mysterious disaster. The winter before had been colder than usual, but that was only the beginning. By the time spring should have brought new life, the air remained chill and the ground stubbornly cold. Farmers waited for warmth that never arrived. Seeds planted in the soil struggled to sprout. Fruit trees stayed bare. Even the grass in the fields grew slowly, as if reluctant to show itself under the dim light. In the marketplaces, food would be scarce. Grain would cost more than usual, and the loaves of bread on the stalls would be smaller. Fishermen might bring in fewer catches, blaming the strange weather for changes in the water. Hunters might return empty-handed, finding that game was harder to track. People would begin to ration what they had, unsure of when things would improve. The skies would be the most unsettling thing of all. Even on clear days, the sun would appear pale, as if it were shining through thin smoke. Its light would be enough to see by, but not enough to warm the skin. Sunrises and sunsets might glow faintly red, but the day in between would be dimmer than you expect, and the evenings would come sooner. This dimness was not the passing shadow of a cloud. It was the constant backdrop to life. If you asked people about it, you might hear different explanations. Some would say it was a sign of God's anger, a punishment for the sins of humanity. Others might think it was the work of evil spirits or omens of great change. People would look at the sky with worry in their eyes, whispering to each other about what it might mean. And yet, life would go on, because it had to. People still needed to tend their fields, gather wood for their fires, and care for their families. But underneath the rhythm of daily life would be a quiet fear, a knowledge that the world was not behaving as it should. That fear would grow as the months passed and the cold continued, as food became harder to find, and as hope for a normal harvest began to fade. Modern scientists believe the strange conditions of 536 were caused by a massive volcanic eruption, or perhaps several, somewhere in the world. The eruption would have sent enormous amounts of ash and dust high into the atmosphere, where it spread across the globe, blocking and scattering sunlight. But in 536, no one knew this. All they knew was what they could see and feel. The sun was weak, the air was cold, and the world felt different. Waking up in 536 would be waking up into uncertainty. It would be stepping into a year where nature itself seemed to have turned against you. It would mean living under a sky that no longer offered the comfort of warmth, in a land where food might not grow, and in a time when people could only guess how long it would last. It was a year that would test endurance, faith, and the ability to adapt. And for many, it would be the beginning of years of hardship still to come. In the chapters ahead, we will walk slowly through this strange year and its aftermath. We will see what the darkness looked like, what the cold felt like, and how people across the world responded. We will follow the path of famine as it spread from village to village, from one kingdom to another. We will explore the theories of what caused it, and we will imagine what it would be like to live day after day under a dim and silent sun. If waking up in 536 sounds unsettling now, remember that for the people of that time, it was not just unsettling, it was their reality. And that reality would earn this year its title as the worst in human history to be alive. Imagine opening your eyes in the year 536 and walking outside on what should be a bright morning. The sun is there, but it feels wrong. Its light is muted, pale, as though it has been covered by a veil you cannot see. The warmth you expect from its rays is missing. The air feels colder than it should be, and there is a faint stillness, a strange quietness, as if the world is holding its breath. To the people of the time, this was a mystery beyond understanding. All they knew was that something had changed, something that was happening everywhere, to everyone. Today, scientists believe that in the early months of 536, the Earth was struck by one of the largest natural disasters in recorded history. Somewhere, perhaps thousands of miles from Europe, a volcano erupted with unimaginable force. The blast hurled enormous quantities of ash, sulfur, and fine dust high into the stratosphere, so high that the particles stayed aloft for months, even years. This thin, invisible shroud wrapped around the globe, scattering and absorbing sunlight before it could reach the ground. The effect was subtle at first, but soon impossible to ignore. Days that never felt fully bright, temperatures that never reached their seasonal highs, and a sky that seemed permanently dulled. We know this now because of three main clues left for us by the past. First, ice cores. Long cylinders of ancient ice drilled from Greenland and Antarctica contain thin, dark layers from this time, full of volcanic ash and sulfur. These layers match perfectly in both hemispheres, proving that something enormous affected the entire planet at the same moment in history. Second, tree rings tell the same story. In the years immediately after 536, trees across much of the northern hemisphere produced unusually narrow rings, a sign that they grew very little during those years. Trees grow slowly in cold summers, and the summers following 536 were among the coldest in centuries. Third, and perhaps most hauntingly, we have eyewitness accounts. From Constantinople, the great historian Procopius wrote, "During this year, a most dread portent took place, for the sun gave forth its light without brightness. It seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear." In Ireland, monks keeping the annals noted a failure of bread, their understated way of recording famine. In China, imperial records describe summer frosts and crop failures that devastated entire regions. From Syria to Scandinavia, scattered reports tell of unusual skies, poor harvests, and the same constant dimness. What makes these accounts so striking is that they come from places thousands of miles apart, yet they match in their descriptions. No matter where you lived, whether in the bustling markets of Byzantium, the green valleys of Ireland, or the distant villages of northern China, you would have looked up and seen the same pale, tired sun. The ash veil did more than change the color of the light. It altered the balance of the seasons. Sunlight is the engine that drives weather, warming the land and the seas. When less sunlight reaches the earth, the entire system shifts. Summers become cooler, winters grow longer, rainfall patterns change. Even oceans respond, their currents slowing or shifting, which in turn changes where and when rains fall. In the year 536, farmers across the northern hemisphere faced these changes without warning. Spring planting began late because the soil stayed cold for longer than anyone could remember. Seeds were slow to sprout. Young plants withered in fields that should have been bursting with green. In some places, early frosts killed crops before they had a chance to ripen. People had explanations, but they were shaped by their cultures, not by science. In Christian Europe, some saw it as a divine punishment, a warning that the end times were near. In parts of Asia, it might have been interpreted as a disturbance in the cosmic order, a sign that heaven itself was displeased. In the north, among Norse peoples, some might have whispered of the wolf Fenrir devouring the sun, an omen of Ragnarok, the end of the world. And because no one knew the cause, no one knew how long it would last. Would the sun brighten again next month, next year, or never? That uncertainty was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. The sun had always been the most dependable force in the sky. Now it seemed unreliable. Even today, scientists debate exactly which volcano was responsible. One strong candidate is an eruption in Iceland, which would explain how quickly the northern hemisphere was affected. Another theory points to a massive tropical eruption, perhaps in Central America or Southeast Asia, whose ash would have spread more evenly to both hemispheres. There is even evidence that more than one volcano erupted in quick succession, compounding the effects. Wherever it was, the eruption must have been of staggering power. It was not just a matter of blocking sunlight for a few days. This was a haze that lasted over a year, followed by a slow recovery that took several more. The particles in the stratosphere would have drifted on high winds, circling the globe many times, thinning only gradually as gravity pulled them back down to Earth. 4 people living in 536. The passage of time under this dim sun must have felt strange. Days blurred together in the same grayish light. The warmth of the seasons seemed confused. Summer days that felt like early spring, autumns that came too soon. The pace of life, tied so closely to planting, harvesting, and preparing for winter, began to stumble. Markets in cities grew quieter as food became scarce. Merchants complained of poor harvests from the countryside. Fishermen, too, found their catches smaller, possibly because the cooler waters disrupted fish migrations. Even animals seemed unsettled. Their breeding patterns and migrations shifted by the strange weather. This was the slow arrival of a crisis, one that began in the skies, but would soon reach every table, every household, every village. Hunger does not strike all at once. It begins as smaller meals, as shared portions that stretch the food a little further. It grows into the absence of certain foods from the market. Then it becomes the constant ache of not having enough. The sudden darkness of 536 was not an immediate catastrophe like an earthquake or a flood. It was a shadow that spread across the world and lingered, silent and inescapable. It was the beginning of years that would test humanity's ability to adapt, endure, and survive. And for those alive at the time, it must have felt as though the very heart of the world, the sun itself, had grown tired. The sky would remain like this for many months, perhaps more than a year. And even when the light slowly returned, the damage had been done. The seasons had been disrupted, the food supply weakened, and the stage set for famine. The worst of the disaster was still to come. But here, in the dimness of 536, the world was already on a path toward one of the hardest decades in human memory. A path lit not by the bright sun of summer, but by a pale, muted light that seemed to promise nothing but hardship ahead. In most years, summer is the season of warmth, growth, and life. It is the time when fields turn green, trees are heavy with leaves, and the air carries the smell of blooming flowers and ripening fruit. But in the year 536, summer never truly came. If you had been alive then, you would have waited for it as you always had. You would have watched the trees in spring, looking for the bright flush of new leaves. You would have hoped for the smell of fresh-cut grass, the hum of bees in the warm air. And you would have expected the heat of the sun to finally chase away the lingering chill of winter. But the warmth never arrived. Even when the calendar said summer had come, the air stayed cool. Mornings carried the damp chill of early spring, and the afternoons, though brighter than winter, never felt hot enough to bring comfort. You might have lit a fire in the hearth on days when you should have been working bare-armed in the fields. And every evening, as the sun sank behind the haze, the coolness crept back quickly, as if darkness itself were carrying the cold. For farmers, this was not just strange, it was a warning. Seeds planted in the soil sprouted slowly, their tender shoots struggling to push through ground that stayed cold long after it should have warmed. Plants that did appear were weaker than normal, their leaves pale, their growth stunted. Wheat and barley, the lifeblood of medieval diets, needed both warmth and sunlight to ripen. Without them, the grain remained thin and green in the fields, never swelling into full, heavy heads. Fruit trees bore little or no fruit that year. Apple trees, which should have been full of blossom in spring, stayed bare for weeks. And when the flowers finally came, they were fewer than anyone could remember. Without enough warmth, the blossoms did not set properly, and by late summer, the branches that should have been heavy with apples were nearly empty. In the countryside, people began to notice changes in the animals, too. Birds that normally migrated north in summer did not arrive in their usual numbers. Some species seemed to delay nesting, as if waiting for better weather that never came. Livestock grew leaner, as pastures failed to provide the rich summer grazing they needed. In some places, cows and sheep had to be fed from stored hay months earlier than normal. Eating into supplies meant for the next winter. The strange summer weather reached into the towns and cities as well. Markets that should have been full of fresh produce were sparse. Vegetables were small and fewer in number. What food was available cost more than usual, and poorer families began to buy less. Bread, the staple food for most people, was often made from grain carried over from the previous year, if the miller still had any to sell. For fishermen, the news was no better. Changes in the temperature of rivers, lakes, and coastal waters may have altered the habits of fish, making them harder to catch. Nets came back lighter, and fishing trips grew longer and riskier in search of a decent haul. This meant less fish for the markets and higher prices for what little there was. Even the people themselves felt the strangeness of the year in their bodies. Without the warmth of summer, dampness lingered in homes, clothing stayed cold after washing, and the smell of smoke from indoor fires clung to everything. Some people developed coughs or chest illnesses that lasted for weeks. Those who worked outdoors in the field or on the roads felt chilled and tired more quickly than usual. The most unsettling part was how quietly it happened. There was no single moment when summer failed to arrive. No day when people could say for certain that something had gone terribly wrong. Instead, it crept in slowly. Each morning, you might wake hoping for the sun to shine more strongly, for the air to carry the dry heat of summer. And each day, you would feel a familiar disappointment as the hours passed without change. The psychological weight of this endless cool season was heavy. People are used to the rhythm of the year, the hope of spring, the fullness of summer, the harvest of autumn, the rest of winter. When one part of that cycle fails, it feels as though time itself has gone wrong. For those in 536, the missing summer was not just a hardship, it was a sign that the natural order of things had been disturbed. In villages, rumors began to grow. Some said the sun had been swallowed by a great shadow. Others claimed that unseen powers had stolen the heat from the world. In some regions, holy men and women led processions carrying icons or sacred relics, praying for the return of the sun's warmth. In others, the people made offerings, hoping to appease whatever force was holding back the summer. The practical consequences were as serious as the spiritual fears. Without a proper summer, harvests in autumn would be poor. And without good harvests, the winter would be hard. By midsummer, many farmers could already see that the coming winter would be lean. Families began to store what they could, cutting back on meals, drying whatever fish, fruit, or vegetables they could find, and guarding their supplies closely. But no matter how carefully they prepared, the lack of summer meant there would not be enough for everyone. This reality settled over communities like a second shadow, darker even than the haze in the sky. People knew that hunger was coming, and they could do little to stop it. In later years, chroniclers would remember this time as a year when the seasons were broken. They would write of summers that felt like winter, of frosts that touched the fields when flowers should have been blooming. They would remember the poor harvests, the hungry months, and the fear of what might come next. A world without summer is more than an inconvenience. It is a slow, grinding disaster. The year 536 showed that you do not need storms, earthquakes, or floods to bring a society to its knees. Sometimes all it takes is the quiet, persistent absence of warmth. The simple failure of the sun to do what it has always done before. And when that happens, the life of every person, rich or poor, begins to feel more uncertain. This was the reality for those who lived in that year. And as the cold summer faded into an early, harsher autumn, the first real signs of crisis would appear. The shortages would grow sharper, the prices higher, the meals smaller, and slowly, hunger would begin to take its place at the table. By the time the year 536 moved into late summer and autumn, it had become clear that the world was facing more than just strange weather. The weak sun and missing warmth had left their mark on the fields, the orchards, and the gardens. Crops were stunted. Fruit trees bore almost nothing. Grain harvests were meager. And this meant that for the people of the time, hunger, real persistent hunger, was drawing near. Hunger rarely arrives in an instant. It begins as a tightening of resources, as smaller portions at the table. Families start by stretching what they have, adding more water to the stew, slicing the bread thinner. In households that still had reserves from the year before, meals continued, but with quiet concern. In poorer homes, the change came sooner. The cupboard was never truly full, but now it began to echo with emptiness. In villages, neighbors who once traded freely began to hold back. Grain that would normally be sold at the market was stored away. Chickens that might have been traded for other goods were kept for their eggs. People began to look ahead to winter with worry in their eyes, calculating in silence whether their stores would last. As word spread from one community to another, the scale of the problem became clearer. This was not a bad harvest in one place to be offset by good harvests elsewhere. It was poor harvests everywhere, all at once. The haze in the sky had touched every region, leaving no corner of the land truly untouched. Markets began to reflect the fear. The price of grain rose sharply. What had once been affordable for most families now took a greater portion of their earnings. Some merchants hoarded their supplies, waiting for prices to rise even further. This was good business for them, but it meant greater hardship for everyone else. For those living in cities, the hunger crept in more quickly. Cities relied on a constant flow of food from the countryside. When that flow slowed, the shortage was felt almost immediately. Bakers could not get enough grain to make bread in their usual quantities. Meat was scarce, with fewer animals fattened for slaughter. Fishmongers brought smaller catches to the stalls. Even the smell of the markets began to change. Less of the rich aroma of fresh baked bread or roasted meat, and more of the dull scent of dried goods and empty spaces. In rural areas, families tried to adapt. Some gathered wild foods, nuts, berries, edible roots. But these too were less abundant than usual. The cooler summer had delayed the ripening of many plants, and in some cases, the fruit never ripened at all. Hunters found that game animals were thinner and harder to find. As the shortage of vegetation and seeds affected their numbers as well. The hunger did not just affect the stomach, it changed the way people thought and behaved. Old rivalries between neighbors could flare into arguments over food. Long-standing agreements to share harvests in times of need were strained or broken. In some places, thefts from granaries or barns became more common. Families locked their storehouses at night, not only against strangers, but sometimes against their own kin. And yet, hunger also drew some people closer together. In small communities, families pooled resources, cooking communal meals so that at least everyone had something to eat. Monasteries and churches sometimes opened their stores to the poor, though even these charitable supplies would not last forever. In the face of shortage, people sought both protection and companionship, because to face hunger alone was far harder than to face it with others. The physical signs of hunger began to appear. Children grew thinner. The elderly tired more quickly. Illness spread more easily among the underfed. A simple fever or infection became harder to survive when the body was weakened by lack of food. People who might once have worked from dawn to dusk now found themselves exhausted halfway through the day. The approach of winter made a situation more urgent. In normal years, autumn was a time of preparation, of gathering in the last of the harvest, drying vegetables, salting meat, storing grain. But in 536, there was less to store. Cellars and granaries that should have been full were only partly filled. The knowledge that there was not enough to last the cold months hung over every household like a shadow. And hunger was not just a local hardship. It was becoming a shared experience across nations. In Ireland, chroniclers would later write of a failure of bread lasting for years. In China, imperial records noted famine alongside unusual weather. In parts of the Eastern Roman Empire, food shortages drove prices so high that ordinary people could not afford even the basics. The hunger was not the same everywhere, but it was widespread enough that travelers, traders, and messengers carried the same grim news wherever they went. The world of 536 was not a connected, global economy as we know it today. But even then, the exchange of goods linked communities. And as those connections spread the knowledge of shortage, they also spread fear. People who might have sold their surplus to distant markets decided to keep it instead. Ships that carried grain to other ports stayed closer to home. The flow of food slowed even more. The hunger also had political consequences. Leaders who failed to provide for their people faced unrest. Rulers who found ways to secure food from distant regions gained loyalty and power. In some areas, grain was taken from the countryside by force to feed the cities, leaving rural families with even less. Resentment simmered in both directions, city against countryside, rich against poor, the well-fed against the hungry. The spreading hunger of 536 was not a single, sharp disaster like a fire or an invasion. It was a creeping, relentless pressure that touched every life in slow, steady waves. Each day brought a little less food, a little more worry, a little more weakness. The body could endure hunger for a time, but when it stretched into months and then years, the toll grew heavier. And yet, at this stage, most people still believed the crisis might pass. They hoped that the next spring would bring warmth, that the next summer would bring a proper harvest. They held on to the belief that the strange weather was only a passing curse, that life would return to normal. But history would prove otherwise. For the people of 536, the hunger that began in that dim, cold summer was only the beginning. Ahead lay years of hardship, years when the hunger would deepen, when disease would find weakened bodies easy prey, when the memory of a full harvest would fade into something that felt like a dream. And in that long season of scarcity, survival itself would become the only goal. By the middle of 536, people everywhere had noticed the same thing. The sun was dimmer than it should be, and the air felt colder. But what no one then could truly understand was that the cause of this strange, pale world was far above their heads, in the upper reaches of the atmosphere, where a fine, almost invisible dust had spread across the sky. Today, scientists call it a stratospheric aerosol veil, a layer of tiny particles, too small to see individually, that can scatter sunlight and make even the brightest day look dull. But in 536, no one had such words or knowledge. To them, it was a mystery, and like all mysteries, it invited fear. The source of this dust veil is now believed to be one or more massive volcanic eruptions. When a volcano erupts with enough force, it can send ash and sulfur high into the stratosphere, far above the clouds, where rain cannot wash it away. There, these particles drift on global winds, circling the Earth over and over. They can remain for months, even years, before slowly settling back down. And when they are up there, they change the way sunlight reaches the ground, and in some wavelengths, blocked altogether. The effect is like looking at the sun through a thin, milky glass. It still shines, but with less strength, less warmth, and less clarity. In 536, this veil seems to have been thick enough to lower average temperatures across much of the northern hemisphere by several degrees, enough to shorten growing seasons and bring frost to places that should have been warm. Even in summer, the coolness lingered. The seasons felt out of joint, as if the world's calendar had been thrown into confusion. Modern scientists have traced this event using ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica. These cores, deep cylinders of ancient ice drilled from the polar regions, are like time capsules of the atmosphere. Each layer of ice records the dust, ash, and trapped air from the year it was formed. In layers dating to 536, scientists found a sudden spike in volcanic ash and sulfur particles. The signature is so strong that it appears in both hemispheres, showing that this was not a small, local eruption, but something that affected the entire planet. The question then becomes, where did it happen? Theories vary. One possibility is a massive eruption in Iceland, a land of fire and ice with a long history of explosive volcanoes. Such an eruption in the far north could easily send ash high into the atmosphere and quickly affect the northern hemisphere. Another theory points to a tropical eruption somewhere near the equator, perhaps in Central America, Indonesia, or Papua New Guinea. Tropical eruptions have an advantage, if one can call it that, because they occur near the middle of the globe. Their ash can spread to both hemispheres more evenly. There is even evidence that it might not have been just one eruption. Some scientists believe there were multiple eruptions within a few years of each other, perhaps one in 536, followed by another around 540. This would explain why the cooling and strange weather persisted for so long, stretching into the early 540s. Historical accounts from the time seem to match this idea. Procopius in Constantinople described a sun that shone without brightness. In Ireland, the annals record years of failure of bread. All of these could be explained by repeated injections of ash and sulfur into the stratosphere, each one renewing the veil above the earth. But for those living through it, the science would not matter. What they saw was a sky that had changed. The blue they were used to was replaced by a faded, grayish hue. Even at midday, the light felt as though it had been filtered through a sheet of pale silk. Sunsets and sunrises often glowed with a faint red or orange tint, the colors distorted by the particles in the air. Travelers would have seen the same strange skies no matter how far they went. A merchant leaving the Mediterranean for the markets of the north would see the same dim sun in every port. A caravan crossing the Silk Road would pass through different lands, hear different languages, yet under the same filtered daylight. The dust in the sky was a constant companion, unshakable, inescapable. For many, the dust veil became a symbol. In Christian lands, it might be seen as the shadow of divine displeasure. In other cultures, it could be read as a cosmic sign, perhaps the breath of a great dragon, or the smoke from battles among the gods. Whatever the interpretation, the meaning was clear. This was not ordinary weather. This was something far greater, far stranger, and far more troubling. The dust in the sky did more than dim the sun. It affected the very rhythm of life. Without bright sunlight to dry fields after rain, the ground stayed damp longer, which in turn made it harder for crops to grow. Without strong warmth, mornings stayed chilly and misty well into the day. The dampness and cold could damage grain, cause rot in stored food, and even affect the health of people and animals. And because the veil was global, no region could fully escape its effects. In some places, it may have rained more than usual as weather patterns shifted. In others, the winds may have carried less rain, bringing drought on top of the cold. These differences only deepened the sense of confusion. Even neighboring regions might report opposite misfortunes, one drowning in rain, the other begging for water, yet both suffering poor harvests all the same. The presence of dust high above the earth was a silent disaster. There was no noise, no shaking of the ground, no sudden flood, only a constant dimness that reminded everyone, every day, that the world had changed. And because it happened slowly and lasted so long, people could not say when it truly began or when it would end. The dust in the sky became the backdrop of life, an ever-present filter through which every season passed. It was in this dimmed world that hunger grew, that crops failed, that animals struggled, and that human beings began to doubt the stability of the world they thought they knew. And though they could not see it, far above their heads, the veil remained, a reminder that the disaster was not yet over, and that the true weight of its consequences was still to come. In the year 536, Constantinople was the beating heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, the empire that today we often call Byzantium. It was a city of towering walls, bustling markets, grand churches, and busy harbors where ships from all across the Mediterranean came to trade. It was a place of wealth and splendor, but also of complexity and fragility. And when the strange dimming of the sun began, life in this glittering imperial capital began to change in ways its people could hardly have imagined. The first signs may have been subtle. Sailors arriving in the city's great harbor might have spoken of pale skies across the Aegean, of cooler winds in what should have been warm months. Farmers from the Thracian countryside who came to sell grain and vegetables. In the city's markets may have complained about slow-growing crops and a stubborn chill in the mornings. At first, these would have been taken as oddities, unusual, but perhaps temporary. But as the months passed, the change could no longer be dismissed. Even in the imperial palace, where Emperor Justinian ruled over his court, the light filtering through the great windows was not the golden glow of normal days. Instead, it was softer, dimmer, as if some invisible cloth had been draped over the sun. In the streets and marketplaces, the people began to speak in hushed tones about what it might mean. In Constantinople, bread was more than food. It was a matter of public order. The city had long depended on grain shipments from across the empire, especially from Egypt, whose fertile Nile Valley was the empire's breadbasket. Grain was brought by ship to the city, stored in massive granaries, and distributed as part of a system that kept the urban population fed and, crucially, kept unrest at bay. But in 536, those shipments began to feel the strain. Egypt itself was not spared from the strange weather. The Nile floods, which depended on rains far to the south, might have been affected by shifting weather patterns. Farmers struggled with changing conditions. Grain yields dropped, and with less to send north, the supply reaching Constantinople grew tighter. In the city's bread markets, lines grew longer. Bakers received less grain and raised prices. For the wealthy, this was an inconvenience. For the poor, it was a threat to survival. Rumors began to spread that merchants were hoarding grain, waiting for prices to rise even higher. Tensions in the streets rose with each passing week. The historian Procopius, who lived through this time, left us a chilling description. During this year, a most dread portent took place, for the sun gave forth its light without brightness. It seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear. His words echo the unease of the people who saw the same pale sun every day, wondering if it was a divine omen. In a deeply religious society, such a sign could not be taken lightly. Priests and bishops would have been called upon to explain it. In sermons, they may have warned of God's displeasure, urging repentance, prayer, and acts of charity. Processions through the streets, carrying relics and icons, may have sought to call back the sun's favor. But prayer could not fill empty stomachs. As autumn came and the year's harvest was gathered, it became clear that supplies would be meager. Grain stores in the city were carefully measured and guarded. Officials faced the delicate task of rationing without sparking unrest. The poorest citizens suffered first and hardest. Malnutrition began to weaken the vulnerable. Children, the elderly, and those already living on the edge. Meanwhile, the machinery of empire still turned. Justinian was a ruler with grand ambitions. He was in the midst of wars in the West to reclaim former Roman territories, and he was overseeing massive building projects, including the construction of the Hagia Sophia after the riots of 532 had burned much of the old city. These endeavors required money, labor, and resources now harder to secure in a time of shortage. Merchants who traded luxury goods such as silk, spices, and fine textiles saw fewer customers. The wealthy still bought, but even they could not ignore the unsettling feeling that the natural order had been disturbed. Foreign envoys arriving in the capital would have noticed the pale skies just as much as the locals, carrying tales of the strange sun back to their homelands. The city's poor, who depended on daily labor, suffered as work became scarce. Building slowed when supplies ran short. Dock workers had fewer ships to unload. Carters made fewer deliveries. Those who lost work found it harder to buy food in the already expensive markets. Begging in the streets became more common, with small children and elderly women holding out hands to passers-by. For the empire's soldiers, the shortage posed its own dangers. Armies marching on campaign required vast amounts of grain and supplies. In lean years, feeding both the civilian population and the military became a delicate balancing act. Soldiers who went hungry could become restless. Discontent in the army was a dangerous thing for any emperor. And beyond the city walls, the countryside was also struggling. Farmers faced the same poor harvests as everyone else, and those who were required to pay taxes or supply grain to the state found themselves in a difficult position. Meeting imperial demands could mean leaving their own families with too little. Resentment toward tax collectors and imperial officials grew in some regions. In this climate of uncertainty, superstition and rumor thrived. Some whispered that the emperor himself had angered God. Others feared that dark forces or foreign sorcery were to blame. In a world where science, as we know it, did not exist, explanations tended to be moral or spiritual. And when the sun itself seemed changed, It was hard to believe that such a sign could be anything but supernatural. Despite all of this, life in Constantinople did not stop. Ships still came and went from the harbors. Markets still opened each morning. Priests still preached in the great churches, and children still played in the narrow alleys. But there was a heaviness in the air, not just in the pale light from the sky, but in the hearts of the people who knew that something was wrong and that it was not ending. In the coming years, this dimming of the sun and the shortages it caused would be only the beginning of the empire's troubles. Within a few short years, another disaster, the Justinianic plague, would arrive to take an even heavier toll. But in 536, the people of Constantinople were already living in a world that felt different, smaller, and colder than before. The Eastern Roman Empire had weathered wars, riots, and invasions. But the slow, creeping crisis of the dim sun was a new kind of challenge, one that could not be fought with armies, negotiated with treaties, or rebuilt with stone. It was a crisis that hung in the sky itself, silent and beyond human reach. By the late 530s, the world had already been reshaped by the strange dimming of the sun. Harvests had failed, trade had faltered, and hunger had become a constant presence. Communities were weakened, not just in body, but in spirit. And it was in this already fragile world that another disaster began to move silently along the trade routes. Carried by ships, merchants, and travelers, it would become one of the deadliest pandemics in history, the Justinianic plague. To understand why this plague struck with such force, you have to imagine what the world looked like after several years of scarcity. People were undernourished, their immune systems weakened. In cities like Constantinople, poor sanitation and crowded housing meant that diseases could spread quickly, even in normal times. In the countryside, families often lived in close quarters with their animals, increasing the chances for germs to cross from one species to another. In a weakened world, any disease would have found an easier path. But the plague was far more than just any disease. The Justinianic plague is believed to have been caused by the same bacterium responsible for the later Black Death of the 14th century, Yersinia pestis. This microscopic killer traveled inside the fleas that infested black rats. And black rats, in turn, traveled with humans, hiding in sacks of grain, crawling into the holds of ships, nesting in warehouses and marketplaces. Wherever grain went, the rats went too. In the aftermath of the poor harvests of 536 and the years that followed, grain shipments were even more valuable than before. Cities depended on them to feed their people. And so grain continued to move along the trade routes, from Egypt to Constantinople, from North Africa to Italy, from ports in the Levant to the islands of the Mediterranean. With every shipment came stowaways, rats and their fleas, carrying the invisible seed of catastrophe. The plague is thought to have reached Constantinople around the year 541. It may have entered through the busy harbor, brought on ships from Egypt. At first, it would have seemed like an ordinary illness, a fever here, a sudden weakness there. But within days, the true nature of the disease became horrifyingly clear. Victims developed swellings or buboes in the armpits, neck, or groin. These were painfully swollen lymph nodes filled with infection. Fevers spiked, delirium set in. Many died within just a few days of showing symptoms. In the narrow streets of Constantinople, it spread from house to house, from family to family. Procopius, the same historian who had described the dim sun of 536, left us another grim account. There was a pestilence by which the whole human race came near to being annihilated. It started with the Egyptians, then spread to Alexandria, and from there over the whole world. At the height of the outbreak, Procopius claimed that 10,000 people died in Constantinople every single day. Modern historians think this number may be exaggerated, but even if it was only a fraction of that, the scale of death would have been almost unimaginable for those living through it. The plague did not stop at the city gates. It spread across the Eastern Roman Empire, following roads and sea routes. It reached the countryside, where it struck villages already struggling to feed themselves. It crossed into Persia, moved along the coasts of the Mediterranean, and crept north into Europe. From the port of Marseille, it spread into Gaul. From Italy, it crossed the Alps. In some regions, entire communities were nearly wiped out. In a world already burdened by years of poor harvests and famine, the plague's impact was multiplied. Fields went untended because there were too few healthy workers. Trade slowed even further as merchants feared traveling to infected ports. In some places, burial grounds filled so quickly that mass graves had to be dug. Religious leaders led prayers and processions, but the disease did not spare the devout any more than it spared the faithless. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical one. In the years of dim sunlight and cold summers, people had grown used to scarcity and struggle. But now they faced something different: the presence of death on a massive, personal scale. Hunger might kill slowly, giving time to hope, to adapt, to endure. The plague killed quickly and without mercy. It could take a healthy man in the morning and leave him cold and lifeless by nightfall. The Justinianic plague did not vanish after one terrible year. Like the later Black Death, it returned again and again in waves over the next 2 centuries. Populations that had begun to recover were struck down again. Cities that had been rebuilt after an outbreak found themselves once more in mourning. Each return of the plague made it harder for societies to recover their former strength. In the Eastern Roman Empire, the combined toll of the dimming of the sun, the famine, and the plague changed the balance of power. Justinian's dreams of resources faded as resources and manpower were consumed by survival at home. Tax revenues fell, armies shrank. In some regions, farmland lay abandoned, the villages empty. For ordinary people, the experience was one of almost unbroken hardship. The cold summers had stolen their harvests. The famine had weakened their bodies. And now the plague was taking friends, neighbors, and family members with shocking speed. For many, it must have felt like the world was ending. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow and grinding collapse. It is impossible to know exactly how many lives the Justinianic plague claimed in its first wave. Some historians estimate tens of millions across the known world. Whatever the true number, it was enough to alter the course of history. Entire regions were depopulated, trade networks shrank, empires weakened. And yet, despite the enormity of the crisis, life did not stop entirely. People still planted crops where they could. Ships still sailed, carrying goods, and sometimes, unknowingly, the disease to distant ports. Children were still born, even in the shadow of famine and plague. But the memory of those years would linger for generations. In the minds of those who lived through it, the dim sun of 536 and the plague of the early 540s would have been linked. The strange weather had been a warning, the famine a prelude, the plague the final blow. Together, they made the middle of the 6th century one of the hardest periods to be alive in all of recorded history. And still, the world moved on, changed, diminished, but not destroyed. The survivors carried the memory with them, and in time, their descendants would live under bright suns again. But for those in the moment, it must have been hard to believe that brighter days could ever return. If you were not an emperor, a bishop, or a wealthy merchant in the year 536, then you were among the vast majority, the ordinary people whose lives depended on the land, the seasons, and the fragile balance of nature. And for people like you, life in this dim, cold, and uncertain time was a slow, grinding struggle to survive. You would likely wake each day before the sun, though in 536, that did not mean waking to a warm, golden dawn. The light that entered your small home would be gray and muted, and the air would be cool even in a month that should have been summer. The first thought in your mind, and perhaps the first words you spoke to your family, would be about food, how much you had left, how much you could spare, and whether you could make it last. If you lived in the countryside, Your work was tied to the fields. Even in these hard years, you had to try to grow crops. In spring, you would have planted what seeds you could, perhaps barley, wheat, or rye, depending on where you lived. But the cold, dim weather had made the soil reluctant to give life. Some seeds rotted in the ground before they could sprout. Others sprouted weakly, their leaves pale and thin. Your tools were simple: a wooden plow, a hoe, a sickle for cutting grain. These had served your family for generations. But now they could do little against a deeper problem: the lack of sunlight and warmth. Each day you worked the land, knowing the harvest would be smaller than you needed. Yet you worked anyway, because to do nothing was worse. If you kept animals, they too felt the change. Sheep grazed on pastures that grew more slowly than before. Cows produced less milk. Chickens laid fewer eggs. The animals themselves seemed leaner, as if the strange sky had stolen some of their strength. For many families, livestock were a form of stored wealth, a way to survive the winter. But now, selling an animal might mean quick food today at the cost of losing milk or wool tomorrow. These were hard choices made over quiet conversations in the dim light of the home. In towns and villages, daily life revolved around the market. Grain was scarce, vegetables small and few, fruit nearly absent. Merchants charged higher prices, not out of greed alone, but because they too had to pay more to get what they sold. Money stretched less far, and for those with no money at all, barter became the only option. You might trade a piece of cloth you had woven, a few eggs from your hens, or a day of labor in return for a sack of grain. Meals were simpler than before. Bread, when you had it, might be made from a mixture of grains, stretched with whatever fillers you could find: beans, chestnuts, or even ground-up acorns. Stews were thin, made with more water than meat or vegetables. On the hardest days, you might eat little more than porridge, and on some days, even that might be scarce. Hunger changes the way people see the world. You would watch your stores carefully, counting each sack of grain, each strip of dried meat, each jar of beans. You would measure food not just in what you could eat today, but in how many days you could make it last. A neighbor arriving at your door might be welcome, but you would also wonder if they had come to ask for food, and if giving it would put your own family in danger. For children, the year 536 was especially hard. They did not fully understand the reason for the strange sky or the empty cupboards, but they felt the hunger and the cold just the same. Parents tried to shield them, giving them larger portions when possible, but this often meant the adults went without. The sound of a child crying from hunger is a powerful thing, and in many homes That year, it was a sound heard too often. Illness was another shadow that hung over daily life. Poor nutrition made people more vulnerable to sickness. A small cut could become infected. A fever could linger for weeks. In villages, there might be a healer, someone with knowledge of herbs and remedies, but without enough food to strengthen the body, even the best remedies could fail. And with the plague now moving through parts of the empire, fear of disease was never far from anyone's mind. The weather itself seemed unfriendly. Days were often cool and damp. Clothes, once wet from rain, took longer to dry. Smoke from cooking fires clung to walls and clothes, making homes smell of ash. In the evenings, families huddled close together for warmth, burning precious fuel sparingly so as not to run out before winter ended. In better years, festivals and gatherings were important breaks from the hard work of survival. But in 536, such celebrations were fewer, quieter, or entirely absent. People had less to share and less reason to rejoice. Even weddings and baptisms, though still held, were more subdued. The mood of the community had shifted, replaced by caution, thrift, and a focus on endurance. Still, there were moments of resilience. Neighbors shared when they could. A family with a small surplus of grain might give some to an elderly couple who could no longer work their fields. Women worked together to mend clothes, sharing needles and thread. Men helped one another repair tools, fences, or carts. In the midst of hardship, the bonds of community were both tested and strengthened. For most ordinary people, news from far-off lands meant little. Whether the strange sky had been caused by a volcano in Iceland or the tropics made no difference to your daily life. What mattered was whether there would be enough food tomorrow, whether your children would stay healthy, and whether the next year might be better. The year 536 was not a single moment of disaster for ordinary people. It was a long, slow erosion of the familiar patterns of life. The dim sky was a constant reminder that something was wrong. But the real hardship was in the small, daily struggles, stretching a meal to feed one more mouth, finding enough firewood to last the night, keeping the will to work a field that might not reward you. And yet, even in such a year, life went on. Babies were born, fields were sown, bread was baked when grain could be found. People laughed when they could, found comfort in each other's company, and dreamed quietly of better days. For ordinary people, survival was not just an act of endurance. It was an act of hope. And in the dim light of 536, hope was as essential as food. When the strange skies of 536 finally began to clear, the change was so gradual that most people might not have been able to point to the exact day it happened. There was no single morning when the sun suddenly returned to its former strength. Instead, the dim haze thinned slowly, almost imperceptibly, over months and years. The light grew a little warmer, the shadows a little sharper, and yet, for the people who had lived through those years, the world never felt quite the same. The first thing people noticed was that the seasons began to return to something closer to normal. But normal now felt like a memory rather than a certainty. Spring came earlier than in the worst years, but the soil was still cool and slow to yield crops. Summer was warmer, but still not as warm as the summers of old. Even the harvests that came after the haze lifted were smaller than before. The earth was recovering, but it was recovering slowly. Communities that had survived the dim years faced the task of rebuilding their lives. For farmers, this meant working the land with renewed determination, hoping to make up for the poor yields of the past seasons. They repaired fences, sharpened tools, and planted as much as they could. But the years of scarcity had left their mark. Some farms had been abandoned when their owners could no longer feed themselves. Those fields now lay overgrown, their soil hard and neglected. In towns and cities, the markets slowly began to fill again, but food remained expensive. Grain from the countryside arrived in larger quantities than in the worst years, but supplies were still limited. The poorest households continued to struggle. Many families had sold valuables or taken on debts to survive the famine, and now they had little left to rebuild their lives. The social fabric in some places had frayed under the strain. Years of hardship had tested trust between neighbors. In communities where people had turned inward and guarded their supplies, suspicion lingered. In others where cooperation had been stronger, the bonds between families had deepened. These differences could shape the character of a village or town for generations. Trade, too, began to recover, but slowly. Merchants who had survived the lean years returned to their roots, carrying goods between regions. Yet the flow of goods was not what it had been before. Some trade routes had fallen quiet when key ports were struck by famine or plague. Some never reopened. The world of commerce had been reshaped by the crisis. The political consequences were equally significant. In the Eastern Roman Empire, Emperor Justinian's ambitions to reconquer the lost western provinces had been undermined by years of scarcity and the devastating arrival of plague. Armies were smaller, tax revenues were lower, and resources were stretched thin. In distant lands, rulers who had once been strong found their authority weakened. In some cases, famine and disease had created openings for rivals or invaders to take advantage. For the ordinary people who had lived through it, the aftermath was not a clean break from the hardship. It was a slow, uneven climb back towards stability. And just as they began to hope for better days, the world reminded them that recovery would not be easy. The plague, which had first struck in the early 540s, did not simply disappear. It returned in waves over the following decades, striking populations still weakened from the famine years. In many regions, the population did not return to its pre-536 levels for generations. Entire villages had been wiped out, their names remembered only in the stories of survivors. Farmland lay empty, waiting for new settlers. Forests crept back into places where fields had once stretched. The landscape itself bore the marks of the years when humans could not keep it fully tamed. Even as the climate slowly improved, memories of the dim years lingered. Stories were told to children about the time when the sun had grown weak and the earth had turned cold. In some cultures, these stories took on a moral tone. They became lessons about the fragility of life, the need for preparation, the importance of sharing in times of need. In others, they were remembered as omens, warnings that such a disaster could happen again without warning. The psychological impact was profound. For those who had known only the steady rhythm of the seasons before 536, the dim years had shattered the belief that nature's patterns could be relied upon. People had learned in the hardest way possible that the sun could change, the earth could fail, and life could be upended without warning. Religious life, too, had been shaped by the crisis. In many places, people turned to faith more strongly than before, seeking comfort and meaning in the midst of suffering. Processions, offerings, and prayers had been a constant presence during the worst years. And in the aftermath, these traditions became part of the cultural memory of the event. In some regions, churches and temples dedicated to protection from famine or plague were built in gratitude for survival. There were also quieter, more personal changes. Families that had lost loved ones adjusted to smaller households. They carried these lessons into adulthood, teaching their own children to be careful with food, to store what they could, to expect that lean times might return. The events of 536 and the years that followed had created a shared experience of hardship across vast distances. From the Mediterranean to the British Isles, from the coasts of Africa to the far reaches of Asia, people had lived under the same pale sun. They had endured the same shortened seasons, the same failed harvests, the same fear of the future. In that sense, the crisis had bound the world together, not in trade or politics, but in suffering. And yet, even after such a shared experience, recovery was uneven. Some places bounced back more quickly than others. Fertile valleys returned to productivity sooner. Coastal towns that could rely on fishing had an advantage, but highland communities or regions already prone to poor harvests took much longer to recover. For some, the worst years had tipped the balance from survival into permanent decline. By the middle of the 6th century, the skies were brighter again, but the scars remained. The world had been tested in a way it had not been for centuries. And though life would eventually find a new equilibrium, the memory of the worst year and the dim years that followed would not be forgotten. For those who had lived through it, the return of brighter sunlight may have felt like a blessing, but it was a blessing touched with caution. They had learned that the world could change without warning, and deep down, they knew that if it had happened once, it could happen again. When we look back across the centuries to the year 536, it can seem like a distant and almost unreal chapter of human history. The people who lived then spoke different languages, wore different clothes, and built their lives around customs and beliefs that may feel far removed from our own. And yet, if you could step into their world, you would find something familiar, the same need for food, shelter, safety, and hope that we carry with us today. The difference is that in 536, those simple needs became much harder to meet. The sun itself seemed to falter, and with it, the rhythm of life that people had trusted for generations. Harvests shrank, the air stayed cold when it should have been warm, and in the long shadow of the strange and stubborn dimness, hunger grew. We have followed the course of those years together, from the first uneasy mornings under the pale sun, through the missing summer and the creeping spread of famine. We have seen how the mystery of the dust in the sky baffled the people of the time, how it stretched across the known world, touching lands that had never met in trade or war. We have seen how it reached into the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, challenging even its wealth and power. We have walked the silent streets during the plague years, when death came quickly and without warning. We have stood in the homes of ordinary people, watching them measure out their grain, mend their clothes by dim firelight, and weigh hard choices with every meal. We have seen how communities shrank, how some bonds grew weaker while others grew stronger. And we have watched as the world began slowly to heal, though not without scars. The year 536 and the years that followed remind us that history is not only made of wars, inventions, and grand speeches. Sometimes it is made in the quiet endurance of people who face the slow, relentless pressure of survival. It is made in the small acts of persistence, planting seeds in cold soil, sharing a little food with a hungry neighbor, teaching a child to hope for better days. We know now, from the perspective of centuries, that the haze eventually lifted. The sun grew stronger, The seasons regained some of their former rhythm. But for the people living then, there was no such certainty. Each day was lived without knowing if tomorrow would be brighter or darker, warmer or colder. Each choice to save a seed, to spare a little bread, to travel in search of food was made in a cloud of uncertainty. And this is perhaps the most human part of the story, that they went on living anyway. They worked their fields, sailed their ships, wove their cloth, raised their children. They married and buried, traded and bargained, prayed and hoped. Even in the hardest years, they found moments of laughter, of comfort, of love. They carried on, not because they knew the future would be better, but because they had no choice but to try. When we imagine waking up in the year 536, it is easy to picture only the hardship, the empty markets, the cold fields, the constant hunger. But it is also worth imagining the resilience. The people who lived through that time were not simply victims of the skies dimming. They were survivors of it. They adapted to what they could not change. And in doing so, they carried humanity through one of its most difficult known chapters. The world they left to their children was not the same as the one they had inherited. Populations were smaller. Some trade routes had vanished. The balance of empires had shifted, but life had continued. Fields were planted again. Markets slowly filled. Children born in the dark years grew up under brighter skies, carrying with them the memory or the inherited stories of a time when the sun had seemed to fade. In our own time, we have the knowledge to explain what they could not. That a great eruption, or perhaps several, had sent dust into the high atmosphere, blocking the sun's light. We can see the evidence in ice cores, in tree rings, in the scattered accounts written by ancient hands. But knowing the cause does not lessen the weight of what they endured. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson of 536. Human history is shaped not only by our knowledge, but by our ability to endure the unknown. When the sky dims and the seasons shift, we live day by day, carrying forward whatever strength we have. And in the quiet persistence of those days, we shape the future, even when we cannot see it clearly. The year 536 is remembered now as the worst year to be alive. It may well deserve that title, but it is also a year and a decade that shows the depth of human resilience. It tells us that even when the world changes in ways we cannot control, there is a thread of survival that runs through us, binding one generation to the next. And so, if you could waken that year and walk among its people, you would see not only the hardship, but also the determination. You would see the way they adapted, the way they shared what little they had, the way they kept moving forward. You would see In the dim light, the quiet strength that has carried humanity through countless trials. The haze would lift, the sun would shine again, and life would return. Changed, perhaps smaller in some ways, but still alive. And in that return, you would see the same truth that has carried us across the centuries, that even in the darkest years, we do not stop hoping for the light.